The First Amendment, right. I mean, it's like, what does it even mean to be American without it? But here's a question. What happens when the person speaking, giving a speech or expressing an opinion isn't actually a citizen? Like, does that change things? Does it complicate things? Especially when that speech is about something like a global flashpoint.
It really does. And that's exactly the kind of tricky territory we're going to be exploring today. We're doing a deep dive into this, well, I'd say really complex and definitely timely issue. It's about the free speech rights of students here in the U.S., but specifically the ones who are not citizens and, the recent actions, really, that the Trump administration has been taking, I guess, targeting those students, especially the ones involved in pro-Palestinian activism, on college campuses and at universities.
Exactly. And we've been looking into it, right? A whole bunch of news reports, some legal analyses, really trying to get a handle on what's actually happening and, what it all means. So the goal here with this deep dive is to, unpack it all. What is the administration actually doing? What are the legal reasons, the justifications that they're using? And I guess most importantly, what does this all mean for free speech? Like for those principles of free speech that we always talk about, especially on college campuses. And, are we about to see a big legal showdown over this whole thing?
I think a showdown is very likely. And I think to get there, we have to understand that what we're seeing is this, it's almost like a collision, right? It's a collision between two massive, seriously weighty areas of law. On the one hand, you have the protections that are offered by the First Amendment, but then on the other hand, you have the government's uncontested authority over immigration.
Okay, so let's get into it, right? The sources we've been looking at, they're all pointing to this, significant increase in enforcement, like a crackdown. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. The Trump administration is definitely zeroing in on, pro-Palestinian activities that are happening on college campuses. And this isn't just about, what people are saying. We're seeing actual, tangible consequences for students, even those with permanent resident green cards, not just temporary visas. And we're seeing it happen at big-name institutions, places like Tufts and Columbia.
So it sounds like they're using some pretty broad legal authority to do this, to be able to actually pull this off. What's the basis for all of this?
The main tool they're using, legally speaking, is this provision tucked away in the Immigration and Nationality Act.
Yeah.
And basically, it gives the Secretary of State this power, right? The power to just revoke, cancel a foreign national's visa if their presence, just being here, or their activities, anything you're doing, is decided to have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about that phrase for a second. Potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. How do you even define that? How do you measure it?
Right. It's so broad. It's not like they have to prove that somebody actually committed a crime or something. Right?
And that is exactly the problem. The government, they don't have to go and present a ton of evidence, proof. Beyond just saying that, hey, these potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences might exist. And, the legal experts we've been reading, they're really concerned about this because it sets a really low bar for evidence. I mean, think about it. It's not actual harm. It's potential harm. It's like saying, well, you might do this, so we're going to do this to you. And that's a lot of leeway. It's hard to fight back against that when there's no concrete evidence of actual wrongdoing. It's like, they're saying you might cause trouble, so we're going to stop you before you can.
And it's not just a few cases here and there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't Secretary Rubio actually give a number for how many visas have been canceled?
He did, and it's a big number. Secretary Rubio said that the State Department has canceled over 300 visas, and most of them, he specifically said, most of them are student visas. And the reason? Well, because these students were involved in pro-Palestinian activities that the administration is basically saying are the same as supporting Hamas.
Wow, over 300. That's a lot. So when you see a number like that, I mean, it definitely looks like things are being handled differently now than they were in the past, right? It's a real shift. But one of the immigration lawyers we read about, he had a slightly different take on it. He was saying maybe it's not quite so black and white.
Yeah, Jonathan Grote, he's the immigration lawyer. And his argument was that the administration isn't really doing anything new, legally speaking. They're not making new laws or new rules. What he's saying is that they're just enforcing the laws that already exist, but they're doing it, more strictly. He actually made this analogy about referees in a game.
Right.
Imagine the refs suddenly get told to call every single penalty, even the little ones, and use all the rules in the book to their full extent.
Which would definitely change the game, right? So that's why things feel so different now, so jarring, as Grode put it. It's not the rules themselves, but the way they're being applied. And, the stricter enforcement, it really comes to life, like you really see it in action, with the case of Rumeysa Öztürk. Can you tell us about her situation?
Rumeysa Öztürk, she's a Turkish national, and she was a PhD student, a doctoral candidate at Tufts University. And what makes her case kind of stand out is that she had a Fulbright scholarship, one of the really prestigious ones. Mm-hmm. But the details of her detention, well, they're pretty strange.
Yeah, 6 masked people, plain clothes, not in uniform, just grabbing her near her apartment. There's even video footage of it. And then, they said they were police, but somebody nearby was like, yeah, right, you don't look like it. Why are you hiding your faces? It's just, it doesn't feel like a normal police encounter at all, like the kind you'd expect.
No, it definitely raises some red flags. The Department of Homeland Security, they're saying that Mrs. Öztürk was involved in activities that supported Hamas, but they haven't actually given any details. They haven't said exactly what she did or, provided any evidence to back up that claim.
But her friends and the lawyers representing her, they're saying she was targeted for a totally different reason, right?
Exactly. They're saying it's all because of what she said publicly, her stance on Palestinian issues. They're pointing to this op-ed that she wrote. She co-authored it, and it was published in the Tufts Daily, the student newspaper. And in the op-ed, she was critical of Tufts, specifically their financial ties to Israel, and she was advocating for divestment, for the university to pull its money out. And she used some strong language, I'll give you that. At one point she wrote, credible accusations against Israel include accounts of deliberate starvation and indiscriminate slaughter of Palestinian civilians and plausible genocide. And her supporters, they're basically saying that the administration is going after her because of this criticism, because she spoke out.
And to make matters even worse, didn't they revoke her visa before even telling her about it? That's messed up.
Yeah, it is. The way it all happened, the timeline, it's really worrying.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets worse. So her legal team, they immediately file a request for a court order, right?
Mm-hmm.
To stop her from being transferred out of Massachusetts without any notice. But, that order didn't exactly stop them.
So they ignored a court order.
Essentially, yeah. They flew her all the way to Louisiana, even though that order was in place. And the government's lawyer later on said that they moved her before they actually received the court order. Come on, that just doesn't sound right.
Seriously. I don't know, it makes you wonder how seriously they take judicial directives, right? But at least there was another legal intervention, right? They didn't just get away with it.
That's right. Judge Denise Casper, she issued another order, this one, to halt her deportation completely. So at least that means that the judiciary, the courts, are starting to take a closer look at whether her detention was even legal and, all the circumstances surrounding her case. It's hard to hear a story like Rumeysa's and not feel for her. A Fulbright scholar being treated like that. It's scary. And it shows just how high the stakes are in all of this.
And this isn't just happening to her, right? It's like a pattern, isn't it? There are other students who have been targeted, other students who have been involved in pro-Palestinian activism.
Unfortunately, you're right. Mahmoud Khalil, he's a graduate student at Columbia, and he actually has a green card. He's a legal permanent resident. But they detained him, too, after he was involved in some pro-Palestinian protests. At first, they said they were revoking his student visa, which obviously didn't make any sense because, well, he has a green card. So then they switched gears and tried to revoke his green card, saying that he left some things out on his immigration forms. But they also brought up foreign policy concerns in his case as well. It's like they're just throwing everything they could at him.
So it seems like even having a green card isn't a guarantee of protection anymore, right? If they want to target you, they'll find a way. And there were other students at Columbia too, right?
Yeah, there was Yinseo Chung, another student at Columbia, also a legal permanent resident, and she's facing possible deportation because of her involvement in pro-Palestinian protests. And then there's Badar Kansuri. He's a researcher at Georgetown. They detained him too. They're saying he has close connections to a Hamas official and that he was actively spreading Hamas propaganda.
So this really does seem to be a concentrated effort, right? They're going after the specific type of activism on campus. And that brings up a really big question, a question of, well, what about their First Amendment rights? These students, they're here in the U.S., don't they have the right to free speech?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where we get to the heart of the conflict here. Legal experts, people like Stephen Yelloware, they're pointing out that this situation is a clash between two fundamental principles. On one hand, you have the right to free speech, which is, it's a cornerstone of American democracy. And a lot of legal interpretations say that this right extends to everyone in the U.S., even non-citizens. But then, on the other hand, you have these broad discretionary powers that the government has when it comes to immigration. Like, they get to decide who can come in, who can stay, and under what conditions. So Yellow Air is saying that the courts, they're going to have to figure out how to balance these two things, these two competing principles.
Because, yeah, the First Amendment, it's huge in America, right?
Oh.
But these individuals, they're not citizens. And when they come here, when they get their visas, there are conditions, right? Like there are expectations for how they'll behave.
Exactly. And that's why people are so worried about what's called the chilling effect. The idea is that if the government keeps aggressively targeting and detaining students just because they're expressing their political views, well, that's going to scare other students, citizens, and non-citizens alike. It's going to make them think twice before speaking out, especially if they disagree with the government. And that could end up suppressing a lot of viewpoints, silencing dissent. Jonathan Groh, the immigration lawyer we talked about earlier, he's one of the people who's been warning about this. He's saying that this whole thing could really chip away at some core American principles. But he also made this really important point, a nuance that we need to understand.
Yeah, I remember that. He was saying that just because non-citizens might have First Amendment rights while they're in the U.S., that doesn't mean the government can't still revoke their visas. Like, there's a legal framework in place, and they're operating within that framework, even if it feels unfair.
Right, exactly. It's a subtle point, but it's crucial. It's like they might have the right to speak, but they can still be punished for it, if that makes sense.
It does. It's complicated, right? So what is the administration actually saying about all of this? Like, what's their justification? Secretary Rubio has been pretty vocal, hasn't he?
Yeah, he definitely has. He's basically saying that student visas, they're for one thing and one thing only, studying. They're not for students to become, and I'm quoting him here, social activists that tear up our university campuses. He's also said that there's no right to a student visa and that judges don't issue them, which is like him implying that the administration has a ton of power to decide who gets a visa and who doesn't, and they can revoke them whenever they want.
So their argument is that a student visa is a privilege, not a right, and that privilege can be taken away if the student does anything they don't like, anything they see as, outside the bounds of what a student should be doing. It's pretty harsh. Didn't Yellow Air mention an older case, something from 1987 that's relevant to all of this? What was the deal with that case?
He did, and it's a really interesting case. Back then, in 87, it was also about pro-Palestinian activists, people who had either student visas or green cards. And the government, they used their immigration powers against them, just like they're doing now. But what's really important is that this case, it dragged on for like 20 years. It was in the courts forever. And in the end, one of the judges actually came out and criticized the government really harshly. He said that what they did was an embarrassment to the rule of law. Like, he was basically saying they went too far.
So history kind of repeating itself then. And based on that case, it seems like we could be in for a long legal battle.
I think that's a pretty safe bet. Legal experts are predicting that this is going to be a long and messy fight, and it could take years to resolve. And think about it, over 300 visa revocations already. That's a lot of cases that are probably going to end up in court. And these cases, they could end up defining how far non-citizens' First Amendment rights actually go, especially when it comes to political speech that the government doesn't like, speech they see as bad for foreign policy.
So just to sum it all up, we've basically got this huge tension here, right? The Trump administration, they're using immigration law to go after pro-Palestinian activism on college campuses. But the problem is doing that raises all these questions about free speech, specifically for students who aren't citizens. And the courts are going to have to sort it all out. It's a mess.
It really is a mess. On one hand, you have the administration saying they have all this power to decide who can be here and who can't, especially when it comes to foreign policy. But on the other hand, there's this fundamental right to express your political views. And a lot of people believe that right should apply to everyone in the U.S., no matter their citizenship status. It's a tough one, that's for sure.
It is tough. After hearing all of this, it makes you think, what does it really mean to have freedom of speech in this country? Does it apply equally to everyone? And if not, then what does that say about us? And what about academic freedom? Like, what happens to universities if international students and scholars start to worry that they could lose their visas just for speaking their minds? That's a chilling thought, isn't it? It's a lot to think about.
It is. It's a lot to think about. And it's not going away anytime soon, I can tell you that.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We hope this has given you some food for thought. This is a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's one that deserves our attention.